Hi, Bob.
Hey, Bob, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How's Washington?
Well, I'm in Virginia, which I much prefer to Washington, actually.
Yeah, well, it's Republican country, Virginia,
No, not anymore.
right?
My district went Obama. Let me tell you, it's been a big shift around here.
Oh, must be hard.
Obama for guns, you know. We got those kind of bumper stickers.
Uh-huh. I've been reading about you. I understand you and Bill Kristol have rebranded your insidious cabal.
Yes, the cabal is really taking on a new menacing quality now.
Yeah.
We actually have 5 people working in the institution rather than 3, which is what we had last time.
Wow, you had real productivity that last time. You got a whole catastrophic war started.
No,
with
it was
people?
really great. You know, one letter. If I didn't have Bob Zellick and Rich Armitage on that letter, though, I don't think it would have worked.
Huh. Well, you know how to pick them.
Yeah, those were the key guys, I think.
So the new thing is called not Project for a New American Century, but the Foreign Policy Initiative?
Well, you can't have too many centuries. You know, I never understood, what did 20th Century Fox do in the 21st century?
I think they changed their name to Fox. I don't know.
They just dropped the 20th century.
The 20th Century Fund changed its name to the Century Fund.
That's right. Well, anyway, we dropped the whole century thing. Now we're just the Foreign Policy Initiative, which I think sounds highly conspiratorial.
Quite the contrary. It sounds harmless. That's why it's so insidious.
Well, you know, it's modeled after there was this famous group that was planning how to divide up Europe after World War I. You know, Walter Lippmann was involved with it. It was called the Inquiry. Mm-hmm. And they met secretly in offices somewhere in Georgetown, I think.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, Lippmann was at the New Republic then, wasn't he?
No, absolutely. I mean, it all ties together because the TNR has sort of been part of the neoconservative conspiracy at one time or another.
They stayed with it for a whole century.
Yeah.
So you wanted to do a little complaining about the kind of press Obama's gotten on his foreign policy?
Well, I don't want to complain. I just find it sometimes... I laugh almost every day I pick up the paper because the stories about Obama's foreign policy seem to fall into 2 categories. One is there's a kind of... I guess there's a button they can press on their computer type machine which says, in a sharp break from the Bush administration... Mm-hmm. Pretty much every story has that in it, even when it's to say, in a sharp break from the Bush administration, Obama administration pushes engagement with China. Mm-hmm. So everything is a sharp break. The other one I'm noticing lately is if Obama's having a problem in foreign policy, the stories try to explain what his problem is, the difficulties that he's facing. So it's a very much, you know, these are the problems that this poor guy is having to deal with, and they are difficult. So there's none of that kind of, accusatory journalism that you sometimes get in dealing with presidents and their foreign policy.
No, although, presidents, I find, they have to kind of earn the accusatory air. I mean, Bush, right after 9/11 got some really nice press for a while, but I think he just kind of burnt through his political capital with perhaps one too many wars or something. I mean, he had his phase. It wasn't a honeymoon phase, strictly speaking, because he didn't get it right after the inauguration, but he had his moment in the sun. But I do think. So you
I don't actually care about comparing him to Bush. Part of it is just. Some of it is not helpful in the sense that there is this kind of bizarre distortion of history, this kind of cartoonish version of the last 16 years, if you want, where basically everything was just hunky-dory. Then you had this moron elected to the White House, and then everything was just a total disaster. And now, we have to pull ourselves out of the disaster. And Bush, never sent a diplomat anywhere, never had a negotiation with anybody. This is all becoming people don't even put quotation marks around these judgments anymore. They're just part of the news analysis. And I think, it's sort of a disservice to history. Life is more complicated than that. And I think Obama's life is going to be more complicated than simply he's doing what Bush didn't do. I mean, on many foreign policies, and I'm sure you'd agree with me on this, there's not that big a distinction between what Obama's doing and what Bush is doing, and in some cases what Clinton was doing before Bush.
Well, in some cases that's true. I think part of the story, though, is that, the second half of the Bush administration was a little different from the first.
Well, the second half of I've heard that 1,000 times. The second half of the Clinton administration was different from the first two. Presidents do adjust, events happen, things change.
Right.
People want to have a very simple-minded view of the Bush administration, and I'm sure Republicans wanted to have a simple-minded view of the Clinton administration, but, He was a two-term president, and for the last 5 years of his term, he had a slightly different approach than in his first, 2.5 years.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what people are doing is contrasting Obama with, Bush circa 03, 04, and I think there are real contrasts in tone and some real contrasts in substance. I mean, that was when Bush was the furthest from being a realist, was the most enthusiastic about, for example, democracy promotion. In one case, promoting it via invasion. And he did.
That's a perfect illustration of the kind of cartoon that has become so embedded that you don't even think twice about saying it. Bush did not invade Iraq to promote democracy in Iraq.
Well, he liked that part of it.
He liked that part of it after the rest of the justification fell apart. Every time the United States invades anywhere, it pretty much attempts to set up a democracy. I could name you 15 different interventions in the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere where that's true. But it simply isn't the case that Bush invaded Iraq to promote democracy. It's just nonsense.
He never cited that as an advantage of...
And every president who's ever gone to war anywhere for any reason has always said that, of course, it's for the larger struggle for democracy. I can go through that list, too, if you want.
So he did cite it as a reason, but you're saying it was not a reason.
It was not the reason. It was not even, I think, the second reason.
No reason was the reason. But the fact is... it really was a big contributing factor to the kind of to support for the war reaching critical mass.
No,
there was a lot of talk about that.
No, that's not true.
It absolutely is.
No, that's not true.
Tom Friedman, in terms of getting liberals on board, I believe Tom Friedman cited that as the fundamental reason to do it.
Tom Friedman is a wild neoconservative idealist, but I don't think...
No, you're missing... I'm saying that
George
in the
Bush,
zeitgeist...
You're going to cite Tom Friedman to give the explanation why George Bush did something.
No, you're saying it is not the reason we invaded. If by the reason... I mean, if we're talking about the reasons that were a prerequisite for the actual invasion, it is central among them. Because it was central in rallying public opinion.
No, I don't.
Bush
I really don't.
I
think the central
thing... And I'm sure you cited it, and Bill Kristol cited it, and the neocons did cite it. They threw it out there enthusiastically. It was picked up by and that was crucial in picking up the liberal hawk support.
Bob.
And it was a big deal.
Bob.
Yeah.
From now on, when you say that I must have said something, you're going to have to go back and find out where I said it, because that was not the argument for...
I only say it in your presence, so you can correct me, Bob.
Oh, okay, then I'm now correcting you. That was not the argument put forward, and it wasn't the argument, primarily the argument that the Clinton administration put forward when it was arguing why Saddam Hussein had to be gotten rid of. I mean, it's very simple. We all know perfectly well that 9/11 was a huge element in building public support for that war. I'm not sure the war would have happened without it. I'm not sure that Al Gore wouldn't have gone in himself with it. But it's certainly democracy did not rally public opinion. The liberal hawks, I think you're talking about 7 people, George Packer and I don't know who else you want to list. They are wonderful and brilliant people, but they do not represent the mainstream of the country. And the country was mostly security-oriented, as was George W. Bush. He didn't come in, as you perfectly well know. He came in as a realist. All presidents go through a transformation as a result of events, but he did not come in as a big democracy promoter.
He came in as a realist and then fell under the sway of, people of your ideology.
How did that happen?
I don't know. Well, the guy had an epiphany that I don't totally comprehend after 9/11.
Well, you don't have any trouble saying that we're the ones who did it, even though you don't know how it happened.
Well, I wasn't there at the meetings.
I wasn't there at the meetings either. I was in Belgium.
Okay,
which I was much further away from the meetings than you were, Bob.
I doubt that. But okay. So what?
Anyway.
Well, first of all, in the liberal, New Yorker supported the war. In all of these, the liberal hawk consensus was important. Democracy was a big part of it. But what would you say was the reason we invaded Iraq?
It was all based on belief about weapons of mass destruction, concerns about ties with terrorism, and the fact that Saddam was a serial aggressor. And I'll tell you how if you want to go back, we could dig up the quotes. If you look at why Joe Klein, hate to bring him up now, supported the war, it was security-oriented. If you go back and look at Hillary Clinton's floor speech in October 2002, preparing to vote for the war, it is predominantly about security, and she says, as a New Yorker, I am particularly concerned about this, which was a direct allusion to September 11th. Those are overwhelmingly the major reasons. Democracy was an afterthought, and this a very successful industry has cropped up to try to say that this was really somehow some democracy promotion idea, which means it was a neoconservative idea, et cetera, et cetera. And that's exactly the kind of historical revision. It isn't even revisionism. It's just historical creation.
Well, I would say democracy / human rights. They were trying to pick up that coalition too, and so there was tremendous.
They didn't have to pick up that coalition. They only had to.
That's what the story was about in the New Yorker and a lot of the key liberal areas was about how Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds, and somehow miraculously this war was going to bring them back to life or something that I didn't understand.
Okay, but then you have your argument with the New Yorker, not with the Bush administration. That just wasn't their primary concern.
Well, Bush certainly cited that.
Of course he cited it.
And I mean, how could, you're saying WMD was at the heart of it. How could any serious person, even at the time, have thought that justified kicking out the UN inspectors who were absolutely guaranteed of discovering any nuclear capability that existed?
Bob, you should be embarrassed. I'm sure you made that point at the time, but if you did, very few other people made it. Even the people who are so beating their breasts about how they were against the war, the famous realist group said, we know Saddam has weapons, but what we need to do is deter them. The number of people who made an argument that there were no weapons of mass destruction...
That's not the argument I'm talking about. I wasn't making that argument. I was saying, assume he does, he probably does. We have the inspectors on the ground. They're being allowed to go to any facility they want to. If nuclear weapons are there, they will find them.
When were they going to... They didn't find them, and they had all the time that they did have. By the way, when would they have...
That's because they weren't there, Bob.
When would they have found them?
They weren't there, okay?
No, they were there. They were there for months leading up to the war.
Wait, the nuclear weapons actually were in Iraq?
No,
this is major revisionism now.
Right, no, I'm saying the inspectors wouldn't have found weapons that weren't there, so I don't see what difference that would have made.
No, I'm saying if anyone's actual sincere goal had been getting rid of nuclear weapons, they would not have had to launch a war. Any thinking person in favor of a war had to have an ulterior motive. Because we had the inspectors there.
Oh, come on,
they were being allowed to go anywhere.
That's just ludicrous. No one believed its inspectors were able to find anything. You have to put yourself, I think you're capable of putting yourself back into the mindset of everybody. And I want to emphasize everybody who believed that Saddam was hiding his weapons, was hiding them from the inspectors.
Right.
You may recall that in the late 1990s, the Clinton administration had repeated confrontations with Saddam Hussein precisely over the inability of weapons inspectors to get access to everything.
But this was 2003, and they were given access everywhere. They were given access to every facility they asked to get into, Bob.
Do you know what Hans Blix's final report said about weapons of mass destruction in March?
You mean after he was kicked out?
Yeah, after he was the final report that he was able to put together, which is we've been unable to account.
It's different from the report he would have put together if we had let him keep looking. That's for sure.
It wouldn't have been different because he still wouldn't have been able. We still haven't been able to account for the things that we couldn't account for. You're just making life too easy for yourself.
But Bob, here's the other thing. Do you
remember how many senators voted for that war?
What is this supposed to mean?
I mean, you're trying to say that anybody with a brain would have understood that we didn't have to go to war, except the 78 senators who voted for the war.
The senators' brains aren't the issue. Courage is. I mean, they just read the polls and vote.
Oh, really? So that would include I guess you're talking about our current vice president, our current secretary of state. Is that your opinion of them?
That's my opinion of enough senators.
Is that your opinion of Joe Biden? Just a poll, just base polls, no courage?
I don't know if I'd say that about Biden himself.
Well, he was a big supporter of the war, as you know.
Yeah, I'm not,
Do you think he's a dummy?
I think when you...
Do you think Joe Biden's a dummy?
When you whip up enough hysteria so that the nation overwhelmingly supports invasion, the Senate's going to vote to support it. There's not a lot of courage in the Senate.
So you're saying that Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton had no courage?
I don't think I said that, Bob.
Well, yeah, they were in the Senate and they voted for the war.
Did I say that every single senator has no courage? I don't recall saying
Okay, so Joe Biden had courage and voted for the war.
It was possible to have courage and vote to the war. I don't know enough about Biden.
What?
But the point is, rational thought was short-circuited. And let me tell you one other thing, okay? We act like we discovered that our intelligence was faulty after we went in and invaded and the war turned out to be a disaster. But the fact is, we supplied the UN with the list of places it inspected. These were all the places we were sure that the weapons were. So the fact is that our government, the Bush administration, knew damn well after the UN got through inspecting the first however many dozen facilities and turned up nothing, that its intelligence was faulty, and they didn't tell us that.
So let me see if I get your argument straight now. You're saying that Bush knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Oh, Bush isn't smart enough to, no, I'm not saying that about Bush.
Well, who are you saying that about?
I'm saying any thinking, intelligent person. Let's get clear. You remain confused about the initial point I made. I did not say any thinking person would have known there were no nuclear weapons. Okay? I said any thinking person who understood nuclear weapons and how hard it is to hide them would know that if the UN inspectors continued to be allowed to inspect any building in Iraq, as they were, then sooner or later we would uncover any nuclear weapons that existed peacefully without a war.
Well, I'm glad you're so confident of that. And by the way, as you know, it was more than nuclear weapons. There were other weapons that people were concerned about, biological weapons in particular.
Yeah, but you know what, Bob? Nobody thought they had a truly scary biological weapon, which would be something that is A, contagious, unlike anthrax.
So nobody thought that?
And B, for which we lack a vaccine, which would be unlike smallpox. So people were saying maybe he has smallpox, maybe he has anthrax. Nobody was saying he had something that's contagious and that we lack a vaccine.
So are you saying anybody?
Nobody thought that.
Are you saying that anybody who made a big deal out of that issue was what?
Not thinking clearly, as happened after 9/11 generally.
Okay, so when I remind you that the Secretary of Defense under the Clinton administration, Bill Cohen, got on a television news show with a 5-pound bag of sugar and talked about the risk of anthrax in that amount and what it could do. If I reminded you of the innumerable speeches given by President Clinton, Madeleine Albright, Sandy Berger, Secretary of Defense Cohen, warning about the enormous dangers in Iraq of their various weapons programs, how would you characterize their level of intelligence?
Well, I don't think I mentioned intelligence, but I would say if they cited that as a reason to invade Iraq, they were seriously confused. And I know Madeleine Albright didn't, because I don't think she even supported the war.
Well, I'm asking you, would you use it to justify any use of military action against Saddam?
In that instance, no.
Well, that's what they did in 1998. They used
Well, then I think they were wrong. I mean, what do you think I am, a Democratic Party flack?
No, actually. I don't think you're that. But
well, then why are you bringing up Democrats that have disagreed with me?
Well, no,
Lots of them have.
Okay, good. Now that you've
But what I want you to do is argue with my logic.
I'm going to.
What was the plausible reason for invading?
I'm in the process of arguing with the logic by making this point to you. Your argument most recently was that the Bush administration, went out of its way to whip up hysteria to justify a war. And what I would say, and what you've now acknowledged, is they didn't whip up any more hysteria than the previous administration had whipped up. So they didn't whip up any hysteria. They basically repeated all of the same charges that the Clinton administration had made about Iraq.
Well, the previous administration wasn't ramping up for an actual war.
I know what you call an actual war. I think if you're...
when you invade and 100,000 people die, that's a war.
No, I got you, but they were ramping up for a military action, right?
Yeah, but and fine. If you want to claim there was a propaganda campaign in the Clinton administration on par with Bush's, I think you're totally wrong. But I don't care. I'm not here to defend the Clinton administration.
What I claim,
I'm here to ask you, what was the valid reason for invading that was related to weapons of mass destruction, which you said was the core of the argument?
The belief that he had weapons of mass destruction, that the inspectors were never going to find them, that he was...
Nobody who understands nuclear weapons thinks that the inspectors would have failed if they had continued to be allowed to inspect anywhere that they wanted to. Now, if they had suddenly been denied access to a facility, then you got a new ballgame, and you can argue for war at that point, Bob. But you didn't wait until that point.
I can't argue with your retroactive, highly superior intelligence, which was more superior than the vast majority of members of Congress, that was more superior than the opinion pages of all the major newspapers, that was more superior than that administration and the previous administration. I mean, you're unique. I can't argue with a man whose intelligence and understanding of these things is unique.
Look, I made these arguments before the war, Bob. I said leave the inspectors in. Now, I honestly thought they would find weapons. I thought the weapons were there. But I said, let the inspectors, if Bush agrees not to invade, then everyone will gladly grant the inspectors another decade. The Security Council would have, and that's what I said. I did think the weapons were there, but I did make this argument.
Well, good. But you were, as you must have felt at the time, you were in an incredible minority, and you want to blame the fact that you were in a minority on some vast conspiratorial propaganda campaign in which Bush didn't really want to invade for weapons of mass destruction, but was invading to promote democracy.
No, I didn't say that.
That's your basic argument.
I didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
I didn't say that.
I thought that was your argument.
No. I mean, the point about democracy, if we want to get back to where we started, was that he did have a period of fervor for democracy promotion that I think does stand in contrast to the Obama campaign's current attitude.
Well,
and that's what people have in mind when they emphasize the contrast along that dimension. And you are seeing real differences there already. I mean, the change in attitude toward Cuba is, in effect, a decision to subordinate short-term rhetorical emphasis on democracy to other interests.
Oh, come on. First of all, we're X months into the administration, and this alleged abandonment of democracy promotion, I think, remains to be seen. The fact is...
Well, you've written that that Obama's not emphasizing democracy promotion.
I've written that rhetorically he's not emphasizing democracy, but we'll see what he actually does. And Bush hardly invented, as you know, the idea of promoting democracy. That was a cardinal position of the Clinton administration before him. Reagan made a big deal about it. Jimmy Carter made a big deal about human rights. John Kennedy, Woodrow Wilson, I could go on and on. I mean, that's hardly unusual, and there's a reason for that. It's very difficult for the United States to not profess any interest in the human rights and democratic aspirations of other people, and I predict this administration will be engaged in that in some way too, but they're so busy making sure that everybody understands how different they are from the Bush administration that now they're not talking about it. But we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see what happens.
Given the fact that it's only 3 months out, there are enough differences for me that I think are substantive. I mean, one of them is the opening to Cuba. Right now it's just travel restrictions.
Well,
I suspect we are moving toward full commercial engagement.
That's pretty, I have to say, I expected significantly more from this administration, and I would have favored. And by the way, that's hardly you shouldn't put that in the category of non-democracy promotion. Most of the people who favor lifting the embargo believe that's the best way to get democracy in Cuba.
Well, I certainly do.
Well, so then why are you using by the way, extremely marginal easing of restrictions that Obama has carried out, which has totally disappointed many people who expected more? But why are you counting that somehow as against democracy promotion?
I wouldn't say, no, I mean, it is against many people in democracy promotion, logically, because they would like to use economic relations as a carrot and a stick and make full economic intercourse conditional on degree of respect for human rights and the thoroughness of the democracy.
I don't think that's right. I don't think that's the way the debate breaks down, Bob. I think that the old Cuban American community, which is getting old, just doesn't want to do any favors for Castro and his brother. End of story. I don't think they're so much. Not all of them are so much concerned about what works best for democracy promotion. And then there's a whole other group of people who are trying to figure out what's best. Is it best if we lift the embargo? Is it best if we go slowly? And I think that. There's an argument to be had between those two people, but I think most of the people on all sides of this debate want to see a change of government in Cuba, which, by the way, is a wonderfully American thing and likely to persist, and not only in Cuba, even during this administration.
Yeah, well, I'm on board. It is a shift from the Bush administration, and indeed from all previous presidents. I concede, but it's not the only shift. I mean, in the realm of nuclear arms control, Bush was against the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Obama is for it.
Well,
Obama is further, I gather, pushing India to accept it. Obama is saying he wants to eliminate all nuclear weapons, which I think is more rhetoric than real. But I think that rhetoric is designed to give cover to places like India to buy into the CTBT. On Iran, he's shifted the official position, right? I mean, the ending of enrichment is no longer a precondition for talks.
Whoa. That, as far as I know, that's not true. I mean, that's David Sanger ran with that story.
So that was reported, but you're saying the Times is wrong about that?
I'm not saying it. Bob Gibbs is saying it. I mean, the White House repudiated it, as did the French government officially. They have not dropped it. Now I see something talking about a freeze for a freeze, which actually is a Bush administration proposal. Aside from an obviously greater willingness to talk with the Iranian regime, I find tremendous consistency across three administrations, really, on Iran policy. If the basic paradigm that guides Iran policy doesn't shift, then everything else is sort of tactical. If we want them to give up their nuclear program, I've long been in favor of talking to them and seeing how that works out and seeing if you could talk any sense into them. But the basic parameters, as the Iranians themselves keep pointing out, where you've got, either you do that or we punish you, that's a pretty consistent American foreign policy, which hasn't worked, but it certainly has been consistent over more than a decade.
Although I suspect we don't know this for sure, but I suspect as far as the enrichment issue goes is that Obama is moving toward a position of being willing to accept indefinite enrichment so long as it is monitored, which I think would be a shift from what the Bush administration was really hoping for.
Well, I think the Bush administration by the end was willing to entertain a lot of possibilities, but just never got around, didn't get around to doing them, and because it was late. I mean, I think the Bush administration was far too late getting into the negotiating process with Iran. It would have been better off getting into it earlier, if only to get through some of these phases that we're going to need to get through before we get back to reality. But I think that the fundamentals have not shifted, and really can't shift. I don't know how Obama. I mean, what would shift would be to say, okay, the Iranians get to have a nuclear weapon. That's a shift in policy. The rest of it is just tactics.
I agree that by the end of Bush's presidency, he was enough of a realist so that. Well, do you agree that Obama's fundamentally a realist? I mean, I might call him a progressive realist because he has a lot of emphases that old-fashioned conservative realists didn't have, like on various multilateral-ish things and global governance-y things. I would call him a progressive realist. But don't you agree that, I mean, you can look at who his national security advisor is and various little things going on. Don't you agree that he has a strong realist instinct?
I mean, not particularly, but that's because the word realist only means one set of things to me, and the term has been so distorted, and I know you have to say progressive realism to distinguish yourself from real realism, which doesn't believe in the United Nations, which doesn't really believe that you can accomplish a great deal with diplomacy, that it's really about power and how power is balanced around the world. That's what real realism is about.
I don't know that that's true.
And when I hear...
Henry Kissinger didn't believe in diplomacy?
He believed in diplomacy, but only as a function of power. I mean, really, I think that it was about, setting up balances of power. That's what realists do. That's what they thought.
And a realist in the modern world recognizes a number of things have changed since Kissinger was a realist. Among them, the United States' relative power in the world, and you negotiate with the strength you have. We have less, relatively speaking, than we used to, and you go with that. But by the way, Hans Morgenthau, if you look at his book on realism, he's like the father of realism, right?
Yeah.
And he says, look, as times change, what realism means will change, and it may mean global government someday.
Yeah, I know, but that was more, that was Morgenthau's sort of cop-out, because at the end of the day, he's a liberal progressive in his own way. But the bottom line of realism, which, it's hard to look into the abyss of realism. That's why not there aren't many real realists. But look, when you talk about a global zero for nuclear weapons, which I think is a perfectly reasonable goal if it's done intelligently. I think you'd have to put that in the realm of idealism. If you look at some of the speeches that Obama's given about how we're going to deal with some of the problems of this planet, I would say there's a tremendous idealistic strain. Even in the campaign, he often gave speeches that were sort of redolent of John F. Kennedy. I think he's got a real idealist streak to him. And again, we're still in the throes, and this is what I kind of want to wait till we can shake out of this. This is why I don't think the press is doing us any favor in this regard. We're still in the throes of saying, much as Bush himself said, I'm everything that the Clinton administration was not, even though that didn't turn out to be quite true. This administration has to say, I'm everything that the Bush administration was not. And we'll go through this period. It'll be however many months it is. And then we'll see what the reality is. As I'm trying to look closely, and by the way, both parties have a real interest in saying this is true because the conservative critics want to say, yeah, you're blowing everything, you're a lunatic, and you're not, looking out for the country's security. And the people who support Obama want to say, yeah, he's completely different from Bush. As I look at these policies and try to distill away all this rhetoric, the policies to me do not seem anything like a radical revolution or even a revolution in American foreign policy, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. But I think it's being tremendously overstated.
No, I think they stand in contrast only with Bush's, couple of years of crazy fervent idealism.
Well, they stand in contrast with Bush, the cartoon figure. He
was messianic for a while about democracy promotion to the point of saying, that all we need in Palestine is elections and Hamas can participate, without pausing to ask himself whether he was going to actually abide by the results if Hamas won, which they did and which he didn't.
Well, he abided by the results. He just didn't deal with the government. Those are two different things.
And that's another thing that I think a realist would do, is actually deal, having found themselves in that position, where Hamas has the power. I think a realist is more inclined to deal with Hamas. I think you see signs of that in Obama
really?
Already.
I must have missed the immediate opening to Hamas that's occurred under the Obama administration.
Well, I think, for one thing, if you look at the advisors he had to, with some embarrassment, jettison during the campaign.
Yeah, how about that?
Right. I mean, I think...
And look who some of his key advisors are. Let me ask you this. Do you think Dennis Ross thinks that we should be...
He didn't put Ross in charge of Israel, Bob.
Yeah, I know,
Ross is over in Iran.
Okay, who is in charge of Israel, by the way?
I think George Mitchell.
Yeah, I think he's on an extended vacation at the moment.
Well, and who's in charge?
I don't know. But the other thing I find interesting about this administration is, was all this, we're going to really get engaged, and we're going to bring peace, we're going to do what Bush didn't do, and basically they've discovered, as they've pretty much acknowledged publicly, they don't really have partners for peace right now, which is kind of the point that the Bush administration was making for the last few years.
Well, they don't have partners in peace in Israel either.
I said partners for peace.
Netanyahu,
I said they don't have partners for peace, but they certainly don't have partners for peace in Palestine, as I'm sure you would acknowledge.
Well, Palestine is in such disarray, thanks largely to the last decade of our policy in Israel's, that there's no coherent anything.
I'm sure it has nothing to do with them.
Nothing. What's that?
It has nothing to do with them.
No, it has something to do with them.
Yeah.
But we don't manipulate those levers. Our policy levers are our behavior.
You know what? You're just making all the right points, but they're all the points to support the fact that we haven't had a radical shift in policy by this administration.
Well, I think circumstances are so much less auspicious than they were during, with Netanyahu and with Lieberman as foreign minister. I mean, give me a break. This is the worst situation.
That's pretty new, but I missed the immediate recognition of Hamas before that, too. That was a possibility, right?
Well, come on. Nobody thinks he's going to do that,
well, he even talked to them.
He has pushed the envelope in terms of antagonizing AIPAC a lot further than Bush did. You would probably agree, even in appointing Mitchell.
So, in the areas where Obama is treading the Bush path, it's because there's now no alternative, whereas before there was an alternative. Is that your basic? Otherwise, he's not treading Bush's path.
I'm just saying, in Israel, if you're asking why hasn't there been dramatic progress in the 2.5 months Obama has had?
Not dramatic progress. I'm not asking for dramatic progress. I'm just saying, Bob, I'm not trying to make a huge point here. I'm just saying, you said he didn't want to talk to Hamas. I'm saying Obama could, in the first month, have sent George Mitchell to talk to Hamas. He could have.
That would be stupid in terms of the domestic politics.
Well,
he's smarter than that.
Are you saying he's shaped by domestic politics?
Any smart politician conducts foreign policy in the context of domestic politics.
That's why you wind up getting a lot of the same foreign policies.
Of course. Look, I agree. There's tremendous continuity from administration to administration generally.
Then we're in agreement. Then that's it.
At the end of the day, you got to deal with these various countries. I mean, I thought that was more my line than yours, because I think you've done some complaining about how little democracy promotion Bush did, whereas I think to some extent he's just facing the reality that, you got to deal with the Egyptian government. They're the government.
Oh, really? Well, let me ask you this. How much of the Egyptian government do you have to deal with? Do you have to deal with Mubarak's son for 20 years after Mubarak?
Well, I think, I personally, it's not a philosophical, it's an empirical question. Difference, I think, between me and you is that I think history is just on the side of growing political pluralism and ultimately democracy, and economic engagement is conducive to that, and especially the proliferation of new technologies is conducive to that. I think the real stubborn problems in that regard are the oil states, which Egypt is not, which can have prosperity without fine-grained economic engagement. But I would say Egypt is in that regard a more hopeful case, and I think you see some of the signs of that. There's a lot more political ferment than there is in some other parts of the Arab world. Don't you agree that in China, Bob, I think even you have kind of, it seems to me you used to be more of a China hawk. I think you've seen in China what I've been arguing was happening, which is that along with their movement to a market system and the infiltration of their economy by these information technologies, you're seeing not democracy, but more political pluralism. The government is having to acknowledge the interests of these more and more organized groups of citizens.
No, first of all, that's not about being a China hawk. You could be a China hawk and think that there's either progress or not progress toward democratization in China. I actually may have moderated somewhat my hawkishness, but I haven't moderated my view that China is not marching toward democracy. I would say, on the contrary, that the regime is figuring out ways to make sure that it stays in unchallenged power for as long as it conceivably can.
It would like to
and
do
I
that.
don't think, it's not at all clear to me that the co-optation of various economic, mostly very rich economic interest groups necessarily produces greater political pluralism. No.
Not just rich. These peasants are rioting and stuff, and the government has to deal with them.
Well, is it dealing with them by giving them a greater political say in how the government is run?
The political say consists in the government being responsive to these groups in anticipation, in acknowledgement of the fact that these groups are getting better and better at organizing with the help of the information technology.
Oh, I think that the information technology is cutting in both ways. Information technology has also been very useful for the Chinese government to figure out who's saying what. There's a tremendous amount of spying that goes on of its own citizens through the information technology, with technologies happily provided by the American firms that provide the information technology.
But Bob, surely if you compare China the day before
don't go back to, I know it's better than Mao. Come on, Bob. Give me a break. Obviously it is.
It's after Mao that the movement toward free markets happened, and I'm saying that's the key variable.
It's not better than it was in the late 80s. It's not better than it was right before Tiananmen Square. I think, and no one thinks it is, Bob. Really.
No one thinks it's better. You're saying it's worse than right before Tiananmen Square in terms of the actual political impact of citizen activism?
I'm saying the prospects of political ferment and opposition in Tiananmen Square, which was being supported by some of the Chinese leaders at the time, who were then, vanquished. That was a much bigger political opening than exists in China right now. Do individual Chinese citizens have a great deal more personal freedom to do what they want? Absolutely. But are we any closer to anything resembling a representative political system? No, I would say we're farther behind.
Farther behind?
Yeah, on that score, sure. By the way, I'm not alone in feeling that way. Most people have been disappointed. I've been hearing now predictions after predictions for a decade now that this next generation of Chinese leaders is finally going to implement political reforms, and the political reforms never occur. If anything, the latest generation has been less willing to countenance genuine political opposition than previous regimes have been. I'm sorry. You can just. I believe, by the way, in progress too, and I like to believe also that eventually all these countries will become democratic because it's a superior form of government which responds to human needs better than any other form of government. But it doesn't seem to me that translates into whatever happens to be happening at the time must be for the best.
No, look, I'm trying to kind of. Think clearly about this, and I know you don't want me to let me compare pre-capitalist China with China now, but it seems to me that's the key comparison if I'm arguing that the movement toward markets is what began the opening.
No. The movement toward markets has helped produce markets. That's I'm disagreeing with you here, Bob.
Do you agree with me that if you compare China on the eve of that reform to China now, we've basically moved from totalitarianism to mere authoritarianism? Do you agree with that?
Well, it's an authoritarianism with totalitarian qualities.
Well, that's better than pure totalitarianism, right?
Yeah, I'm Bob. If you think the argument ends with me saying China's better off than it was under Mao, then we can end the argument right here.
And what's your explanation for why it's happened?
First of all, Mao was a particularly acute form of totalitarianism, and I'm not sure it could be sustained by anybody. The norm in human societies is either liberalism or authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is the normal form of dictatorship.
No, the
right?
Soviets. Wouldn't you say the Soviets were totalitarian for much of their
The
communist
Soviets were
history?
totalitarian for much of their history. Right,
So
now they're
was...
simply authoritarian. I agree. And by the way, and I already said, and I'll say it again, in terms of the personal space, in terms of the ability of people to live their lives, make their money, there's no question, and I said this before, there's no question that the Chinese people are better off than they were under Mao. Now, that's a different thing from saying that we have we've seen real political space being offered to the Chinese people. The Chinese government offers the Chinese people a very clear bargain. You can live your lives, live your private lives, make your money, but don't stick your nose into politics. And you know what happens to people in China who stick their nose into politics.
It depends on what you mean. If they protest about an issue that matters to them and get the government's attention, that is often being tolerated.
Well, yeah.
I mean, see, you're thinking of this kind of elite kind of thing where you have seminars, which I'm all in favor of. I think discourse should be as open as possible at all levels. I'd love it if that were happening. But I think since most Chinese do not work at think tanks, it's not the only question is not whether they get the kind of freedom of expression you enjoy.
I'm glad you think those peasants really feel great about what's happening right now.
They feel better than they did 30 years ago.
It's not as if all authoritarian governments haven't faced protests. I mean, the Chilean government faced protests for decades. Right? Marcos faced protests for decades. The South Koreans faced the authoritarian government faced protests for decades. Protests don't prove that you have a political opening.
Well, if the protests are respected, and A, not crushed, but B, actually acknowledged and responded to, that's progress. And, I'm just saying, let's be realistic here. We had a completely totalitarian state like 30, 40 years ago. It's massive. It's got an entrenched communist bureaucracy. You're not going to get democracy overnight, and that's a silly litmus test.
Well, I'm agreeing you're not going to get democracy overnight. I don't think you're going to get democracy in China for decades, if then. Is that your position also?
It may take decades to get through democracy, but if political pluralism and freedom of speech
Bob, you want to have it both ways. You want to have, there's a great political opening in China, but actually there's not going to be a real political opening for decades. I mean, we're in agreement if that's what your position is.
There are political openings that are short of pure democracy. There are degrees of freedom.
Way short.
Life is way better for them than it was. But anyway, we were going to talk about a bunch of things.
Yeah, you got pirate solutions.
Well, I feel guilty about I somehow feel guilty for the way we have spent all this time talking about nothing that we thought we were going to talk about. So I'm willing to not give you my miraculous pirate solution, if you'd rather I not, and give you the freedom to talk about things you mentioned, like, well, you touched on Iran a little, but you wanted to talk about that and the defense budget.
Bob,
yeah.
You said you had the solution to the pirate problem, and I want to hear it, and so do your viewers, by the way.
Okay, here we go. The thing that's being said about the pirate problem is you can't arm the merchant ships because ports do not allow armed merchant ships to enter their ports, okay?
Yeah.
And changing this aspect of maritime law would I don't know how complicated it would be in terms of how many moving parts there are to the structure of maritime law, but one reason people are saying it's almost impossible is that understandably countries do not want armed foreign nationals entering their ports, right?
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to give you two choices of ways to solve this problem. The first one I know you'll love because it involves the United Nations. I finally figured out a way to use these blue helmets and let them actually fire their guns.
Oh, I like it. I already like it.
Okay. You just agree that the only armed people on these ships
are blue helmet UN people.
And look, you laugh, but the security...
I'm not laughing, I like it.
This is one thing the Security Council would get behind, right?
You'd think.
None of the big five like pirates.
You'd think.
So you can have blue helmets, a few blue helmets on each ship. All they need is automatic rifles.
Right.
They are allowed to respond to any attempt to forcefully board a ship by whatever force is necessary.
Well, are they? I guess is that not a problem, getting people to shoot people who haven't shot at you yet?
Well, in my ideal world, it would not be a problem. Because I think...
Because, there has been a problem with blue helmets in the past on the ground.
I know. I would want to change that.
Yeah. I like it, Bob. I think it's ingenious, and I think you should write it up.
Okay,
I mean, I'm not saying that everybody isn't going to be watching this and know from watching this what your idea is. But
you don't think... Okay, I have a second solution that you may prefer.
Okay. I like that one, though.
I'm glad to hear that. You really do. Maybe we should co-author the op-ed.
Yeah, sure.
You write it.
Oh, great, yeah.
It's my idea. It's my idea.
So that's why you should write it.
I'm the brains of this team, Bob, for crying out loud.
Okay.
I think you're right.
Okay, I'll get back to you on that.
But the second one is more of a short-term solution. But, like, all you do is, if the problem is the arms being there when they enter the port, for any American ships, at least this is something the U.S. could do, any American ships that are passing through these particularly dangerous waters, you put a few Navy SEALs on each one, and then when they get to the port, these guys get in a rubber raft and go back to the mothership, so the ships are not armed when they enter the port.
I think your first idea is better. I don't know if we have enough Navy SEALs to put everywhere they might be needed, you know. I mean, that's a lot of... I'm not sure that's the best use of Navy SEALs.
For this purpose, you could put me and you with a BB gun on the ship, and it would just about work. I mean, these pirates are incredibly vulnerable when they're trying to board the ship. If you've got a gun, they're dead meat.
I'm with you, and so is Freddie Clay, who I think wrote the you should be arming the ships, or arming crews on the ships. But, you know, some people have raised the serious point, and there is a serious point. I mean, yes, it's all looked pretty funny, you know, with these pirates and everything, but they can escalate too, presumably. You can't be sure that the BB gun is necessarily, in the long run, going to do it. So I much prefer your blue helmet option because once the UN gets committed to something like that, it kind of has to remain committed. Or, I mean, I guess there's been occasions when it's pulled out, but I think that's a good option.
Well, the other virtue is that then the blowback doesn't all fall on America. It doesn't look like just America playing tough guy. It's the whole world doing it. Now, there is the problem of, I mean, the deterrence will be much more effective if you basically shoot without asking questions. In other words, if the pirates know that they're not going to have, you know, if they happen to find a ship that doesn't have blue helmets for whatever reason, they're not going to have the option to say, just kidding, if the blue helmets show up, right?
No, they've got to know that they've got no chance. Now, here's an objection that someone raised when I made the point about you ought to just arm some of the sailors. You know, these ships are huge, and apparently making sure that the entire perimeter is covered all the time is a pretty manpower-intensive task.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe there's enough blue helmets to go around.
Wait,
Well, it's a big ship. They can grapple up any part of it, right?
Oh, but I gotta think that any half-decent, whether it's radar or sonar or what, they got stuff that could monitor
what,
the surrounding
individuals
waters
climbing out of a dinghy? I don't know. You and I are now
I think they could find the dinghy. I think they could spot the dinghy.
We're well out of our depth. But in any case, I like your idea.
Okay.
All right.
So then you have time to talk about Iran and or defense budget.
Well, we kind of talked about Iran.
Okay, defense budget or AFPAC?
You wanted to talk about AFPAC. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What is your view on the legality under international law of the drone strikes?
I think they're illegal under international law.
Illegal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Doesn't that bother you?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of them. On grounds of... I am agnostic on the question of whether they're doing more harm than good, although I have found a couple of items in the news recently that lead me toward the more harm than good position. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal about some interviews that I guess that Richard Holbrooke conducted with people who are relative moderates.
Well...
And they were saying, you guys are hated, that you're bombing our neighbors, and we're thinking about joining the radicals.
There's an article out today, I think, in by Jane Perlez, which actually has polling data, which suggests otherwise. It's a very interesting article, by the way.
That most Pakistanis support, you mean?
That people in the region support it.
Okay.
Because, they're not crazy about the people in their midst. It's a very good article because it also talks about the sort of tacit agreement of Pakistan, which I think might get around the international, it's not actual agreement, but it's sort of tacit agreement. Mm-hmm. So maybe that gets around the international legality issue. But I just was wondering, since I know that you get, your view is that if we start breaking international laws on these kinds of things, you really do, corrode the whole system and you make it difficult to build up international law.
Right.
Yeah.
So, no, I very much think that, I realize that the Pakistani government has domestic reasons not to explicitly endorse these things. But I think if we're going to do them, I would very much like to see, if we're going to do them with Pakistani support, I would very much like to see the Pakistani government step up and say, you have our permission. And I don't think we should do them if they don't.
Well, also, maybe you need a UN Security Council resolution.
Well, that would be enough, but I don't think you're going to get that, do you?
Well, that's always been my position, that you can't get that, but you don't want to, then you get, I don't know, you're not happy with me saying that you can't get it, therefore we should do it anyway.
Right, I'm happy with saying we can't get it, and we can't get the Pakistani government to admit they like it, so
well, so
let's
your
not do it.
position, I think I understand. Your position is if we can't get the Pakistani government to officially permit it, and you can't get a UN Security Council resolution, then the Obama administration should stop it.
I would, yeah, I think I'd say that. I mean, certainly in light of the grave doubts as to whether it's in my mind, on whether it's on balance effective.
Well, that's, right, but I mean, I just wonder whether, someday some Spanish court is going to bring some Obama administration official into the court to charge them with breaking international law and drone attacks.
Well, one thing you'll be happy to hear I'm actually not enthusiastic about is this idea that any given nation has the entire world as its jurisdiction.
I am happy to hear that.
I don't like that.
Well, what do you think about AFPAC? I mean, I don't know. I think since we've spoken, there's been more kind of, the Obama administration, since we last spoke, has come out with its policy. There's some grumbling on the right, but I sense a much greater, more quiet, but nevertheless real sort of general unhappiness on the liberal side and on the left side that Obama has upped the ante and really deepened the American commitment in Afghanistan. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I don't know enough about the region to say. I'm still trying to sort through this question of whether the drone strikes are on balance worthwhile, leaving aside the international law.
No, I'm not talking about the drone strikes. I'm talking about the new Afghanistan strategy.
The whole strategy. I don't know enough. I mean, the kinds of things you hear are that, on the complaining side, are that to the extent that the surge worked in Iraq, it's not all that transplantable to what is, in fact, a very different kind of social terrain. You hear that.
Yeah.
What I worry about is that the decision to get back to the drone strikes, which is a big part of the policy, that the decision about the drone strikes is being governed by the question of what helps us in the short term in Afghanistan, because that's our biggest, the command structure is focused mainly on Afghanistan, and I think they're maybe not paying enough attention to the long-term consequences on Pakistan. And so I worry that's just a bias that's built into the decision-making. You might say, on the other hand, hey, if the Pakistani government likes them, presumably they want to survive as a government and not see a successful national insurgency. So maybe I don't know, but those are things I worry about. What do I think about? I don't know. I don't know, for example.
Well, put it this way, I don't sense a lot of enthusiasm on your part.
No, I'm absolutely not enthusiastic. I mean, on the other hand, I'm not wild about the thought of surrendering Afghanistan to Taliban control on a number of, it's a mess.
Yeah. Because I found it interesting. You mentioned our new organization, the Foreign Policy Initiative. Our sort of first and only event was an Afghanistan event, which was actually quite bipartisan. We had Democratic congressmen. We had the guy who's the head of the Center for a New American Security Policy. I think it's something like that. Anyway, and some of the biggest...
Although I would call that the hawkish side of the liberal... was...
They weren't Democrats, though. They weren't even just Joe Lieberman Democrats.
Was National Security Network there?
Pardon?
Was the National Security Network there?
I think they might have been in the audience. I don't know. Anyway.
You should invite them next time if you're really going to be ecumenical about it.
Okay, you can tell me who to invite. But in any case, the interesting thing, as you probably know, is that, some of us more hawkish people, I think, are much more supportive of what Obama's doing in Afghanistan than maybe a lot of Obama's own supporters.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, Obama got a lot of fervent support from people who are to my left, for crying out. Serious does.
Yes.
So they're not going to be enthusiastic. I mean, I was never, for example, urging rapid withdrawal from Iraq once we were in the mess. But it's a very tough situation. I mean, supposedly one of the more hopeful scenarios is you find these moderate Taliban and you say you can have Afghanistan so long as it's not a haven for terrorists.
Yeah, well...
I don't know if they exist, A. B, there's going to be people not crazy about the way they're treating women. So I don't know, what is the best end game? What's the best realistic scenario for the way this works out well?
Well, I think the best realistic scenario is that in order to get the moderate Taliban to be the moderate Taliban, you actually have to make progress militarily, both because you have to demonstrate that there really isn't another radical alternative, and also that it's safe to make a deal with the Americans. You know, I mean, you can't make a deal with the Americans if the Americans are on their way out, right? That's not a good deal-making opportunity. So I think that what Obama's doing is in fact the right thing, and I think, but what's going to be interesting to me is I think he's going to wind up calling for even more troops at the end of this year, and I'm just wondering how long, a group of people who supported him, who think that they were supporting a real revolution in American foreign policy, what do they do when that's not the case? It strikes me, again, getting back to one of our early parts of this conversation, that Obama is, proving to be a pretty traditional kind of president. I was very struck, since we can now put the pirates and PAC and all this stuff together, that the press, in its desire to make sure everybody likes Obama, sort of gave him a big cheer of applause when the snipers killed the 3 pirates. Didn't you get that sense?
I was happy about it.
Yeah, no, I know, but I mean, the president's like, way to go, you've proved to everyone that you have your medal, and I was always struck by that, because after living in Europe for years, only an American president has to prove himself by shedding blood early in his administration. You would agree that's pretty unique for...
you mean European leaders don't?
No. On the contrary.
You mean it doesn't impress their people?
No one is asking when the press stories came out about the pirates and the shooting, the sniper shots. It was all like Obama had passed a test, a test of leadership, like Carter had failed the test, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, maybe it's not a formal test, but under some circumstances, the Europeans like their leaders to kill a bunch of people, right?
No, not really, no.
What about Maggie Thatcher and the Falkland Islands?
Well, Maggie Thatcher's Britain is no longer with us, but in any case, Britain is not the Europe I'm talking about. I'm talking about continental Europe.
Real Europe.
I mean, I just think it's interesting. I'm not being critical of anybody. I just think it is interesting.
Well, I think a Democratic president in particular, though, compared to a Republican. And I think there are real doubts about Obama. In fact, I'm surprised he's not taking a little flack, and maybe he is in places I haven't seen, for making the killings contingent on the guy's life being manifestly in danger.
Well, I think he's rightly not saying much of anything. I mean, the actions speak for themselves, and I support the actions, and I think he did demonstrate it. I just think it's interesting that he's being tested in this very traditional American, can you pull the trigger effectively sense, which really does make us stand out still as a power. Yeah,
I don't think with McCain it would have been a big question, though. I think it's because he's a Democrat.
I think you're right. You're probably right. A Democrat in the post-Vietnam era has to prove himself in a way that a Democrat in the pre-Vietnam era, didn't have to prove himself quite so much, but probably still had to prove himself to some extent.
Mm-hmm. So, anything you do want to say quickly about the defense budget that's a little on your mind?
Well, I think
Gates did this thing. Now, is it a big net cut? It's not so much that as a repositioning, is it?
I would say that by and large, some of the cuts he's making, I think, are right. Some of the cuts he's making are in brainstorms of the Rumsfeld era, which were these clever weapons that we were going to use. And I think he's certainly right to put the emphasis back on the wars we're fighting. My only concern, I have 2 concerns. One is that in terms of the wars we're fighting, they have not, in fact, increased the ground forces enough. This is one of the really big mistakes that the Bush administration made, refusing to bite the bullet and increase the size of the ground force, even though we were involved in these 2 wars. And I'm worried that even though they're increasing it somewhat, it's not enough. The other thing that's interesting to me, because I was always annoyed with the Rumsfeld whiz kids who said, we shouldn't worry about what's going on right now, we have to worry about the war we're going to fight 25 years from now. I only worry a little bit that Gates is now moving too much in the other direction, that it's only about what we're doing now, and we don't have to worry about 20, 25 years from now. I think that's not, you have to strike a good balance on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I would differ over
I'm
what's
sure we would,
20,
because I don't think there can
now.
possibly be any wars 20 years from now.
I wouldn't say that. I would say if we play our cards right and continue to foster economic engagement and a commensurate degree of global governance, we will not have to worry about a great power war, which I think is what you're worried.
That was a very common view in 1900, too. Sorry, you don't have to respond to that. It was a quip.
No, the Norman Angell book is what you're talking about, and that's actually been a little misrepresented, but, they were wrong, and I'm right. That's the difference.
That's right, and that's a perfectly rational answer on your part.
Yes, it's possible that they were wrong, and yet you could say the same thing now and be right. So, okay, so we should, it's been an hour, we should get to work on this op-ed piece. It's going to revolutionize the world's view of you in particular.
You can send me bullet and tick points.
Okay.
If you can bring yourself to do that, I don't know.
It's a deal. I mean, you're the one with the forum, you know. When do you owe the Washington Post your next column?
Well, the Times will print you anytime you want to be printed, and I can't write for the Times, so it's a problem.
Are you blackballed there? Because I could put in a good word for you.
No, I have a commitment to the Post.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can't help you there.
I know, but we could write in the Post, but you have to send me bullets and ticks.
They're in the mail.
Okay.
All right, thanks a lot,
All right,
Bob.
take it easy.
See you.